Okay, Bismillah Rahman Rahim and Assalamu alaikum and welcome to our new series that we will be running for Al-Mawrid UK. This series is going to explore an interesting subject, uh, the intersection of psychology and religion and the field of psychology of religion. And in this series, we will be talking about the key questions in the field of psychology of religion, and we'll give you an intellectual history of the 20th century psychology, primarily through three key figures, and and the impact of modernism on this psychological inquiry. So this is going to be our series. Today we are doing a first session, and in this first session, we will be introducing the series and we will be talking about the topics at a high level. And to deliver this, highly interesting series, we've invited a colleague of ours from Al-Mawrid, UK, Mr. Luqmaan Waqar, our dear friend. He's currently doing a PhD in psychology from King's College, and I'll hand over to him, and he will do a proper introduction of the series, of the current session, and of himself. So over to you, Luqman. Please go ahead and introduce yourself. Let me know if you want to share the slides now before you do the introduction.
Can you please share the slides?
All right, then. I'll switch to the slides. Thank you very much.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for everyone who's joined online and all those who'll be watching the recording of this later. So this is being done as an engagement with those present and for prosperity. So as Rosa very kindly introduced, the lecture series that will be beginning today is titled The Psychologization of Religion. And I think over the course of the next 40 minutes to an hour, it will become clear why the title was chosen and what direction the course will take and what questions will we try to answer, which thinkers will be approaching, and then the works and ideas. So before we begin with the topic, typically if it's just one lecture, I wouldn't need to introduce myself at length, but because it's an eight lecture series, I thought a bit of background on the speaker might be a bit helpful. So as Rosa rightly pointed out, I'm currently in the UK. I'm born and bred in London, here currently because I'm pursuing a PhD in psychology at King's College, London. So my own research area is on the topic of loneliness and how loneliness and social isolation contributes to poor mental health, and looking at that from various quantitative and qualitative aspects. But my education up till this point has all been in psychology as well. So through various institutions in the UK, I did an undergraduate in psychology, did a master's in psychoanalysis, and then another master's in research methods in psychology. So there has been, as far as my academic career is concerned, up till this point, a consistent thread of interest in psychological inquiry. And as you can see from that first master's, which was in psychoanalysis, so that's Freudian and Jungian theory, and how that is applied in understanding various aspects of human, social, and religious life. So a lot of that will be coming together in this lecture series. And actually my bachelor's dissertation itself was on the level of religiosity and spirituality among Muslims and the relation of that to mental health and well-being. So this lecture series gives me an opportunity to have like a culmination of my various academic interests over the previous say 12, 13 years now. Perhaps just a bit of backdrop about where my association with Al-Mawrid comes. So with what Rosa said, I'm just like an affiliate with the organization, and there'll be a disclaimer in the beginning saying that not everything I say is endorsed by Al-Mawrid, and that's absolutely true. Al-Mawrid is just creating a platform for people to have various intellectual and religious discussions, and given my background in psychology and Al-Mawrid's religious interest, but also their willingness to allow platforms for intellectual inquiry when this comes together. That's why I've been invited by Rosa to give a lecture series on a topic like this. But I think a small biographical detail would be about how I got involved with Al-Mawrid. I find mostly people who I engage with have some kind of active relationship with Pakistan. So I was born and raised in London, but I did live in Pakistan from 2002 to 2008, and it was during this period that I actually became familiar with the works and the thought of Javed Ahmed Gandhi because of his presence on various television shows at the time. This Arj TV and Geo used to have these question and answer sessions or debates. I remember seeing, I believe, debate with him and Pervez Hoodboy on the topic of atheism and Islam. So Gandhi Sahib and his subsequently his organization has always been some sort of presence in my life from a very young age. But I think particularly over the last, I think 12 years, I think I've been much more actively engaged with this thought and a sense of comparative analysis with the other schools of thoughts that are happening. And Javed Ahmed Gandhi Sahib came to the UK in just before COVID in 2020, and that's when I got to meet him, and then we had some masterclass sessions with him, and that's where I met Rosa, and our correspondence began, and hence the subsequent invitation to do this. So just that disclaimer on the bottom again. I that's my positionality with my academic background and my own limitations of understanding of the field of psychology and the field of Islam, and where those come together. Any limitations or are entirely my own. So just know that from the beginning. And also, I think another major disclaimer to make at the beginning here is that some of the thinkers that we'll be discussing, Freud, Jung, and even to an extent William James, they were very, very, very controversial in their time, and their ideas shocked people back then, and they shock people now. So unless you're very well versed in psychoanalysis or Jungian psychology, some of the ideas might be a bit abrasive and subversive, but you know that's worth mentioning right at the top. But we'll go ahead and then even if you haven't engaged with those thinkers, that much of the beginning of the lectures will be an exposition of their thought and their ideas, and then we'll see how they synthesize it and try to understand religion in their own psychologies of religion. So as Rosa said, this lecture is mostly an introduction to the course, which will be 7 lectures after this. So I think why we are here talking about this particular topic as a particularly interesting story as well. So after COVID happened, I think, and then after Gandhi Sahab's visit in the UK, I met Rosa at some point, and then in our discussions we started talking about modern psychologists and their understanding of religion, and then invariably the much derided name of Jordan Peterson came up, and then I expressed my own disdain of his opinions and ideas, and where that emanated from, and how that this man ostensibly talks about religion in this symbolic manner. People often I speak to, Muslims and even non-Muslims, seem to think that Jordan Peterson is talking about religion as it is, as we understand it as a concept, whereas my misgiving of him was that he purely understands it from a very symbolic perspective of how modern man understands, say the myth of Jesus purely on a symbolic and psychological level, which is a very subtle but major difference in the way he approaches religion, and that expresses itself most clearly in the fact that he isn't a practicing Christian. And Jordan Peterson seems to have a lot of influence on young men, even Muslim men. So I think Rosa suggested that potentially I could do a lecture refuting Jordan Peterson, but I thought that would be almost futile, because Peterson is just an emanation of a way of approaching religion that existed at the beginning of this century, and even you could say some decades preceding the early 1900s. So I thought it would be much more interesting to talk about those individuals who essentially, as my title implies, psychologized the understanding of religion, and that's what the process of this course will be. So initially we thought we could talk about one of the major books in that field, what's called the Psychology of Religion. Is the book by William James called The Varieties of Religious Experience. So we thought we could have a lecture series talking about that book, which was also actually a lecture series, 20 of them given in the University of Edinburgh in 1901. Then I thought, pulling back from, again, Peterson to all the way back, the main thinkers of the field, not just William James, but that would be Freud and Jung. And what that would do is that not only give a backdrop to that kind of understanding of organized religion and individual human religious experience, but it would also give a history of psychology. Because, I mean, ask any psychologist who the most influential psychologists were, and invariably, I'd say in the top three, you would get Freud and Jung. And William James. William James to this day remains the most influential American psychologist. So this lecture could, in a sense, be a history of the origins of modern psychology in some ways as well. And then I think Wilhelm Reich, well, yes and no. I think Wilhelm, sorry, that came up in a comment. So Wilhelm Reich, he was a Freudian, and even within current Freudian circles, he comes as like an afterthought. Reich had a huge influence on subsequent postmodernism and the sexual revolution of the 1960s. So yeah, in terms of influence, definitely I'd count that. But I mean, no one would place the writings of Reich up with definitely with Freud or Jung or James at this point. Sorry, back to what I was saying. So it's, in a sense, this lecture series is not merely the history of the origins of the psychology of religion, but in many ways history of origins of modern psychology, but also modern thought. So if one had to nominate, again, I'm doing this top three thing, of three thinkers perhaps that influence modern thought the most and postmodern thought, in my estimation, that would be Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud, and then Jung as an offshoot of Sigmund Freud. So, and I think in order to understand modern and postmodern thought, understanding those thinkers is absolutely essential. And so, in some ways, this is at least a third of the necessary ideas that allowed for, say, modernism and postmodernism, particularly the French variants, to develop and thrive. So 3 levels: the origins of the psychology of religion, the origins of psychology, and in some ways the origin of modern thought. And I thought that would be a fantastic opportunity to do so in say this 8 lecture period that we have. Because if I had to just look at the psychology of religion, the field, as I think we'll start unpacking, it's just so broad, and there's so many psychologies, and there's so many perceptions of religion, and there are so many religions. I mean, there are entire master's courses based on this topic. There are entire books published on this topic. There's like a 150-year history of this field. So I thought I'd focus on that point of those 3 thinkers and that kind of inversion, as I'll unpack shortly, that happened in that period that had tremendous impact on psychology to this day. So, I mean, even though in many psychology circles, Sigmund Freud is, for the most part, a punchline now, a joke for some people, but the parlance and the language and the psychological epistemology and ontology that he introduced, psychology hasn't moved on since then, and and to understand where these fields are at this moment, it would be important to go back and see what those thinkers thought in that period. But more importantly, we will be elaborating primarily on how their view, their Weltanschauung, their worldview, fed into their own interpretation and theories about the origins and experiences of religion. So that's a much expanded version of what I think I want, what I hope that this course will achieve. So I'm not endorsing any of their views. I am not Freudian. I'm not a Jungian. I'm not a disciple of William James either. So keep a critical stance throughout, and I hope that will be expressed in the thoughts and questions and queries that come after. So there will be 8 lectures. So this is the first introductory overview lecture. It will be much briefer than what will come every couple of weeks. So we're doing this every other Sunday. So I don't want to overburden yourself and myself as well, doing a PhD and I've come to my final year, so for concurrent studies at the moment. So you'll have plenty of time between the lectures and to catch up with the recordings if you wish to do so. So every Sunday at 2 p.m. GMT, 7 more lectures after this, and each lecture, the remaining 7 will typically be 2 hours. So we'll have 55-minute chunks of 2, and then have like a 10-minute break in the middle, and then hopefully questions towards the end. There'll be no set reading or homework that you have to go through. So when I'll be dealing with the thinkers, I will go down to the basics and go provide an overview of their thought. So, but if you want, I will suggest reading along the way, which I will be talking about anyway. So if you want a head start, you can touch on those readings yourself. Yeah. So I think we can dive right in now. So I think before we go into the specific thinkers, Freud, born in the 1850s and dies in 1838 or 9. Jung, I think a couple decades younger than him, and William James is around the same age as Sigmund Freud. So the ideas that they came up didn't emerge in a vacuum. There was plenty of ideas in other domains, in other fields, in other subjects that allowed for the ideas that Sigmund Freud had and Jung had and James had to develop and gain expression in the manner that they did. So to give an extremely truncated history of events, there was a major event within Europe, or what's termed as an event in Europe, which allowed for that to happen, and that was the Enlightenment. So the post-Reformation Enlightenment that essentially inverted scientific epistemology and ontology in the way it perceived itself in relation to God and itself in relation to humanity in general. So what happened essentially was how traditional religion viewed God and scripture and faith and all this stuff was that the knowledge of God was understood through revelation and scripture and religious experience and, say, the mystic experience and monasticism. But through the process of in enlightenment, and we'll go through some of those thinkers who there were, a concrete idea emerged that God does not create man, but man creates God. So in order to understand God and the concept of God, it purely being a concept, there not being, for most people, especially ardent atheists among this camp, there not being a God, in order to understand religion and the concept of God, you'd have to actually understand the individual, because God being the creation of the individual, you'd have to understand the individual psychology, the individual sociology, the anthropology, and techniques of modern philosophy in order to understand religion. So it was no longer about being an exegete of the Bible, the Quran, in order to understand God, but rather it was about inverting your worldview from upwards to inwards in understanding what psychological processes go on to create religion. Now, this had sort of been a current for a long time in philosophy, so dating as far back as Aristotle and Plato, but that's them trying to understand how the soul relates to God, God being an external reality, and then of course the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, and then obviously in the Islamic tradition, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd. But the first real break in that post Descartes comes in the work of David Hume, who wrote the work The Natural History of Religion, in which he actually drawing back sort of from the Roman poet Lucretius, who had this kind of really asserted that God was born from images that appear in dreams and was a necessary being due to the fear of nature's destructive power, and that was expressed in his writings, passingly. But David Hume really drew onto that, and then developed an entire philosophy and psychology of religion, in which he would him being an ardent atheist, would argue that human ill temper and rage is as a result of religion. And I think he argued that it's a combination of fear, but also presenting sacrifices to the priest in order to appease a raging god, and all this results in internal ill temper, rage, and ruthless kind of persecution of unbelievers. So within that term, within philosophy, the philosophers started thinking about how conceptions or understandings of God can lead to psychological states and expressions, such as persecution. And after Hume, I think there was that philosophical trend carrying on, most famously in Kant, Immanuel Kant, the German idealist, who argued that, who said actually that David Hume was the person who woke him up from his dogmatic slumber. And then within that thought, through Kant and Schopenhauer, then you get the greatest expression in one of the other major modern thinkers, and one of the most well-known atheists, obviously Friedrich Nietzsche. But another current that comes within that thought, and I think touches importantly on the psychology of religion, that is the slightly less well-known philosopher, and he kind of falls in between. But at least now he's known as kind of like a bridge between Hegel and Karl Marx, and that's Ludwig Feuerbach, who presented his own projection theory of religion, which is one of the most major works in that period. And the ideas presented in that book, The Essence of Christianity in 1841 and The Essence of Religion a few years later, had a huge impact on obviously Marx, but also later on Freud, and Freud will talk about in depth, but also Nietzsche and subsequent thought on religion. So his idea was that religion was basically a projection of religion was, or gods was, human beings projecting whatever attributes they desire into this higher being. So if they want let's see, or them projecting this sense of lack of control in this world onto this other thing. So if human beings feel helpless as a result of, say, storms or the rain or whatever, they project the idea that it's actually God controlling this process. Or say if they want to feel a sense of helplessness in this world, if they want to feel a sense of control, at least in his work on the essence of Christianity, he says that we project an idea of God returning to the world and then sacrificing himself for this creature to kind of like elevate human beings and give them a bit of a higher station than what they normally have. So the idea of projection, meaning again that the idea of that God doesn't create man, but man creates God, and placing whatever idealized images into this being to understand God was actually was posited by Feuerbach, and then later a lot of this will be echoed in Freud's own ideas of God, and particularly if you're familiar with psychoanalysis already, that the words projection and what will emerge, like wish fulfillment appearing in God and religion, that will be a bit of an echo. So this idea obviously was hugely influential on Karl Marx's own materialism and atheism as well. So perhaps for a separate different course altogether on the sociology of religion, one could explore the ideas of their three main thinkers. That would be Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And concurrently, they emerged an anthropology of religion. So actually, Feuerbach himself called this project the anthropology of religion, and this was picked up by writers like James Fraser in this well-known book called Golden Bough, and E.B. Tyler. But around the same time, and I think the major seismic shift that happened within the sciences and then ultimately the social sciences was obviously the writing of Charles Darwin and the publication of The Origin of Species. Suddenly the philosophical currents had some sort of credence now, a biological theory that they could attribute to what they were already arguing in terms of God not being the mover of history or the origin of the universe and its direction since. And that's where I think, following Darwin, the proper psychological study of religion begins by that individual who I named after Darwin, G. Stanley Hall. So Stanley Hall was actually the first person to be awarded a PhD in psychology in America. He was actually supervised by William James, and then in 1881 he did a public talk in Boston about the relation between adolescence and conversion. So this was the first instance of someone actually linking a cogent theory with religious expression. And Stanley Hall, being a Darwinist, he had this entire view of the human life being an expression of long-term evolution. So you got the savage as a child, and then adolescence, you had like religious kind of experience, and then adulthood and maturity would result in atheism and godlessness. So you kind of see this expression of Darwinism coming in through his thought. And actually he bought onto the whole Darwin project, hook, line and sinker. So he was a huge advocate of eugenics. He was all pro. He reviled the disabled and the poor, and was all for forced sterilization and selective breeding, and Darwinism seems to be a current through those early psychologists as well. So he was a huge influence on William James as well, who we'll talk about, and a massive impact on Sigmund Freud. So that's how. With it, what I tried to do perhaps in the last few minutes was try to give overall change in trying to understand religion through all the fields. And this is where these early scientists, and that they began calling themselves psychologists, tried to understand not only human nature, the world, but more importantly religion as well. And while they were at the sort of the cusp of the end of the century, where Nietzsche declared God is dead, they began to understand, okay, how do human beings understand God? And then Freud came up with his own very interesting theories. Jung had his own ideas, as did William James, and that's where we'll delve onto. But before we go into that, I think some definitions might be in order. So when we're talking about the psychology of religion or psychologization of religion, what do we even mean by those terms? So psychology itself, there is no one psychology. So just etymological roots of the term. In Greek, psyche means the soul, and the logos means the study. So traditionally it meant the study of the soul, but now the working definition is it's basically the study of the human mind and behavior, and mostly from a completely materialist perspective, and a lot of it having to do with those early psychologists and them being complete Darwinists and viewing the human mind and motivation in that manner. So there is no unifying theory in psychology as it emerged in the late 1800s all the way up to this point. There have been some very dominant schools, but they're very competing, and they have very different principles and assumptions about human behavior. So some of the most well-known and as a dominant of those would be the psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory, which would include Freud and initially Jung, although he's an offshoot of that movement. Melanie Klein and Jacques Lacan developed later on. And then another major school would be behaviorism, which view all human behavior emanating from risk and reward, and how certain actions or how humans behave, as behaviorism is conditioned through access or through maximization of pleasure and minimization of punishment. Some very known theorists of that would be Skinner, Ivan Pavlov, and Watson. And then there was a big tussle between psychodynamic theory and behaviorism up till the 1950s, and then humanistic psychology through the work of Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers emerged. But then subsequently, since many other schools have gained much more traction, there's evolutionary psychology, which kind of filters through all of them in many ways as well. So that there wouldn't be any major evolutionary psychology theorists, but there can be much more dialed in and focused on. And then neuropsychology, which looks at much more how states of the brain are related specifically to behavior. There are several other schools, but I think these are the major ones. And of the ones that we'll be talking about, it was primarily psychodynamic theory at the beginning of the last century that tried to provide an overarching theory of human behavior, and then thus including religion as well, and then basically set in many ways the scope and the limitations of the field for decades and perhaps even now centuries since to come. So we will be then honing in on Freud and Jung from this. So knowing that even when I say the psychology of religion, so I find asked with the populist, the comment has vanished, but I think what I captured from it is that would popular psychologists Jordan Peterson and Steven Pinker be categorized as evolutionary psychologists? Absolutely. But then again, as I said, because evolutionary psychology is filtered through all the other schools, and most psychologists now take evolutionary theory as scripture. Most of them fall into that aspect. So, for instance, Steven Pinker, very much being a linguist and a cognitive psychologist, he is an absolute advocate of evolutionary psychology as this Jordan Peterson in that regard. Yeah, but then he also pulling from psychodynamic theory and particularly from Jung as well. So again, there's no one psychology, and then that's just about the history of the last 150 years. If you want to step into more murky territory, how do we define religion? So I think now you're getting a sense of how why you kind of have to pick a very specific niche in answering specific questions because of these such massive and broad terms. But again, let's go into the etymological roots of the word. In Latin, religio was first used to designate a greater than human power that required a person to respond to in a certain way and avoid some dire consequences. But religio also has several other applications as well. It can refer to a feeling that is present in persons who vividly conceive and observe such power. And it also comes to designate the ritual acts carried out to a shrine of a particular god. That's just the etymology, but once the application comes into place, W.C. Smith, in his very well-known work, The Meaning and End of Religion, says that in every instance of that application, it refers to something that one does, or one feels deeply about, or that impinges on one's will, exacting obedience, or threatening disaster, or offering reward, or binging on bringing one into one's community. So that's a summary of the various applications of the etymological roots of the word. But what made Smith's work so major in that period was that he argued that the concept of religion is basically a modern construct altogether, and it merely serves a purpose for outsiders in categorizing another set of peoples and their beliefs into this thing called religion. And that's how we've come to understand religion in many ways, and how traditional societies and what we now call religions didn't have a concept of religion. Because now when we talk about it, it's like religion is this thing you do, right? Like it's thing that you can do on Sunday or some rituals that you do. This is religion. Whereas even in the Islamic concept of deen, it's an all-encompassing concept which religion just doesn't cut. I mean, I was hearing, I went to see an author last weekend, and then he was also talking about religion being a modern construct, and he said it's like it doesn't make sense to a traditional person because it's like saying the concept of gravity only applies to someone at this time of the day or on a Sunday morning, or the sky is only blue at Jummah. It just doesn't make any sense. So it's a very tenuous and disputed term in itself. So people have suggested other terms that can be applied. So Smith himself gives two potential alternative terms, of like cumulative tradition, which is so like religion would imply something that is fixed, but whereas cumulative tradition, which is something that is acquired over time, and then the rituals and practices that come with it is a much more dynamic, flowing description of the observable aspects that he wants to touch. But something that is less observable and eternal is faith and piety, and that gains expression through poetry and painting and music and scripture and so on and so forth. So after the two definitions, I think it'll be difficult to then pin down what are we talking about when we're talking about psychology of religion. And I think that keep this critical opinion when we discuss the specific thinkers and their works and what specifically they're touching on. So it could be that they're just honing on a very specific theological aspect of Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism, that is, or a very specific point about Christian theology. So an attack on religion is just know what they mean by religion specifically. So, for instance, for the longest time, I was terrified of reading Nietzsche. And once I actually got to read him, it was about him specifically attacking aspects of Christianity, and particularly the doctrines of St. Paul. So, not all attacks on religion are to be like, keep a critical mindset of what is actually being done and from what perspective it's being done. So Nietzsche had a very specific ontological and epistemological perspective. Same thing when we approach Freud and Jung and William James. They're coming from a very specific positionality in which they approach the specific aspects of religion which they're tackling. So just some I think expository definitions at the beginning, or lack of definitions. Perhaps you had an idea of what psychology of religion meant in a clear-cut definition, and perhaps we've sort of muddied that water a little, or shown that it's a bit more complex when we turn to the thinkers. So then, combining those two terms, then what is the psychological study of religion? And again, as I said, there are entire master's courses based on this topic. There are entire books on this topic. But what appears is that there appear, at least to me, there appear to be two trends which emerge in the literature. One is a descriptive trend, which is just about talking, again, as the term suggests, describing what those religious experiences are and what those states are, and essentially, currently at least, how that can relate to mental health. So the descriptive trend goes back to scripture itself. You get writings going back to, like, St. Augustine's Confessions. Within Sufi literature, Imam Ghazali, Ibn Arabi talk about their own mystical experiences, and that runs through a lot of religious and spiritual literature. I think and then William James touches on that in the varieties of religious experience, where he's talking about religious and mystical experiences. So he's kind of partially doing the descriptive trend. Most of this is done by religious people themselves, because for most people, the source of their faith are the religious experiences they've had of what they've heard from the saints and other people. I was speaking to a gentleman yesterday who was a devout Protestant Christian, and then his faith was completely unshakable, and then the source of that came from at least what he told me of 3 specific religious experiences. So a lot of this section, the descriptive side, is done from people explaining their religious experience. The second one is the explanatory one, which aims to, again, as I said, as a result of that inversion, try to understand the origins of religious thought, religious feeling, and the concept of God. That is very much the camp that Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung are in. Now, with William James, although he does the description of the religious experiences, there's a bit of theory of the origins of that as well. So that's fundamentally, I think, what the few questions that's like broadly what's known as the psychology of religion aims to deal with. So as I said earlier, my focus would be on that early process of the psychologists, so like the sociologists, so Weber and Durkheim and Marx, who were doing the sociological analysis of religion. The major thinkers who were involved at the beginning were Sigmund Freud, Jung, and William James. So I'm looking at that a very particular period and those thinkers and where that inversion then took place, which currents run through up till this current day. Now, it's a very fascinating, a very interesting picture in the background. I will probably go back to it afterwards. Wait, I did make an edit which is not appearing on this, I think, but it's a very interesting photo because all 3 of those thinkers are in this. So in 1909, Stanley Hall, G. Stanley Hall, who was the president of Clark University at the time, invited 150 psychologists, or 170 world-leading psychologists, to Clark University for a series of conferences and talks. And it was during a time when Freud and Jung were very close collaborators at the time. So all of Freud and Jung went to the United States, and then Freud delivered his famous introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. And so I did have it highlighted in the original presentation, which isn't showing up, but I hope you can see the pointer. But this is G. Stanley Hall right in the middle. And then flanked to his right on the front row, you have Sigmund Freud, and then Jung here, and then you've got William James right here in this corner. And William James was actually Stanley Hall's PhD supervisor. He was only a few years old at the time. And very interesting gathering and photo, and that a few other major psychologists at the time. Much of the early psychoanalytic movement was there. Even had Emma Goldman, the famed anarchist thinker, in these. So yeah, so people we'll be dealing with are primarily in this photo. And we will touch, I'll elaborate a little more on Stanley Hall when it comes to William James, because they represent a very, because firstly, he was the first person to initiate that psychological study of religion, and many of his students, Edwin Starbuck and a couple of other students he supervised, and then William James took on from him, and they had a very particular outlook. And then there's another group which could broadly call the German tradition in looking at this, which emerges from another of the earliest psychologists in Germany, Wilhelm Wundt, who Stanley Hall studied with, and then expanding further with the psychoanalytic critique of religion through Freud and Jung. So another photo of Stanley Hall and flanked by Jung and Freud. So as I said, Jung and Freud belong to this broader, what is now categorized as this school of thought known as depth psychology. So if you're not familiar with their thought at all, what they fundamentally all agree on or have a sense on is the idea that the unconscious, rather than conscious behavior, is a primary driver of virtually all human behavior and thought, and by extension, religion. There are many schools within depth psychology as well. So just to name a few, you've got the Freud school, you've got Anna Freud's school called ego psychology. Then you have Jung break off and form his own school of analytical psychology. There's an object relation schools within the UK. You've got a different school in the United States. You've got a Lacanian school within France. So a lot of diverging ideas and approaches, but what they fundamentally agree on is the idea of the unconscious as a driver of human behavior. And that wasn't necessarily a novel idea. A lot of the ideas can be found in Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, who had this idea of the will being this, undifferentiated driving force for all human activity. And then various philosophers after him tried to, differentiate what that will is. So, Freud famously applying the will towards sex and love, and later on the death drive, as it were, and then Nietzsche famously in the will to power. So the idea of the will and what that will was very much being developed in that late 19th and early 20th century period. So within the depth psychology, as I said, we'll be looking at the works of Freud and Jung. So Freud with his little cabal of psychoanalysts. Again, what would be very interesting to just point out at the top is that how, in their attempt to attack religion, they basically, in a sense, formed their own kind of pseudo religion in many ways as well. So there are very interesting parallels of Jewish mysticism in Freud's own ideas, but the way he himself presented himself as this kind of this new prophet, and had this cabal of very loyal proteges and students around him, and if anyone would diverge too much, they'll be excommunicated and be like heretics. And then as Jung did in 1911, and then formed his own school. So we'll have two lectures on Freud and psychoanalysis. So the first lecture, actually I'll go into depth towards the end about what the structure of that might be like. But then I said the major divergence, and then perhaps the major theorist after Freud was Jung, and through his school of analytical psychology. So retaining the idea of the unconscious that Freud applied, but in a very different way, expanding it by an idea called the collective unconscious, and now archetypes of religious function then drive a person's religious behavior. So again, we'll have two lectures on Jung as well, and on his main ideas, and then about his specific psychology of religion. And these were the more dealing with these thinkers dealt more with the origins of religious thought and expression. And then, as I said, then you've got William James, who wrote one of the most influential book in the field, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which was much more descriptive. And not only is it one of the most influential books in the field, but also within the philosophy of religion as well, but any non-fiction book altogether. So the major publisher, Modern Library, did a list of the most influential non-fiction books of the 20th century, and I think they placed Varieties of Religious Experience at either number 1 or number 2. So it's had a tremendous influence since. It was based on it was a collection of lectures that he gave, the Gifford lectures at the University of Edinburgh, 20 lectures, and then compartmentalized into a book. So we've got 20 lectures to work through in 2 lectures of mine. So so in those 2 lectures that we've dedicated to William James, we'll be talking about the varieties of religious experience, but also his other work called The Will to Believe. Yes, so that's how it is. So what we have now is, because the lectures will be fortnightly, we're coming up to the end of May now. So June will be the 2 lectures of Freud. So at the sort of at the middle of June, and then wherever the every other Sunday falls. So we've got easily or nicely compartmentalized this. As in June, we've got Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. In July, the 2 lectures will deal with Jung and analytical psychology, of religious experience. And then September will attempt, and it will be an ambitious project, to give a truncated history of the field since, and what the contemporary currents are, what the current challenges are, and conclusions that emerge from not just our sort of detailed dive into the thinkers and their thoughts from the lectures 2 to 7, but what the challenges, that the questions that those presented, and what the current challenges might be. So next week specifically, not next week, in 2 weeks, the 14 days from now, will be the first lecture on psychoanalysis and Freud. And as I said, I will aim to give as comprehensive an introduction on the thinker and their thought as possible. So because Freud and his work now falls into the category of depth psychology, I'll give a general overview of what depth psychology is and where Freud and Jung fall into that. Then we'll go into Freud and his life and times and his major ideas and theories, and how psychoanalytic theory developed as a result of his thought. And towards the end, we'll have a slight overview, a teaser, if you will, of his psychology of religion. And then in the 3rd lecture, we'll really unpack the works and ideas that emanated from his thought about religion. So as I said, there's no homework, but if you wish to do so over the next, in the month of June, the work that we'll be touching on his psychology of religion is primarily contained in 4 works, which is The Future of an Illusion, Totem and Taboo, what's slightly being obscured by the camera there is Civilization, it's Discontents, and Moses and Monotheism. All of them are fairly short works. So yeah, but in that order. So Future of an Illusion is the primary work. Again, Future of an Illusion drawing from Feuerbach's idea that religion being an illusion and wish fulfillment, and so on and so forth. So sort of developing that further. And then Totem and Taboo, which I actually read when I was like perhaps 16, and shocking work. So just a disclaimer before you read that. And then in order, if you want to proceed, Moses and Monotheism was actually published a year after he died. It was the last work he ever wrote, and it's a very bizarre, weird work about the origins of monotheism. And but yeah, so that's the next week. And yeah, so as I said, today was just a bit of an introduction and that invitation and hopefully enticement to invest your valuable Sunday afternoon and joining me in going through the psychologization of religion. So that's my email if you wish to get in touch about any reading or about any questions you might have outside of the lectures. And then Twitter Twitter, which I don't use too much anyway, but that's where I'll be posting most of my academic work when I don't have the political drive to post something silly. So thank you very much for joining me for this hour. The next lecture will be 2 weeks from now. It will be 2 hours, so I look forward to seeing you there. So if you've got any questions about what's been said so far, or about the structure of the course, or anything I missed out, I'll be more than happy to take them now.
So thank you very much for that, Luqmaan, and that was very, very interesting. I've got a few questions about that myself, so I'll open with those, and then I'll ask my other esteemed participants to ask their questions, and then we'll wrap up the session. Okay, so first thing I'd like to ask you in regards to this, I mean, you've identified a few people that seem to be at the center of this new movement of understanding not only human behavior and psychology, but also their expression of religion, or um, uh, their understanding of religion. And you mentioned this, you mentioned this these words. I don't know, I forgot who said them, but you said that God didn't create man, but man created God, right? Who said that, those words?
I think it was Feuerbach.
All right, cool, cool. So I mean, when somebody says these words, I sense that they've made a kind of an epistemological break over there, right? They have shifted everything. They turned everything on its head by saying those words, because now you are completely going to change your epistemology and understand everything in a completely new light.
Mm.
So that's a major change that has happened, and that to me represents that suddenly secularism has taken over the understanding of this subject. So I mean, this is how I'm perceiving it. What do you think has happened when they when they describe the situation in those words?
I think that is the birth of humanism and the birth of individualism, where again, God isn't the center of the universe anymore. It's just mankind, and then mankind becomes the place where everything emerges from, and that sees full expression in something like existentialism, where you just exist without an essence. So again, that word I used, inversion, I kind of stole that from René Guénon, who did this really in-depth analysis of that era. And then he's big on the idea of inversion. So again, your epistemology becomes away from God and scripture and turns inwards. It's about yourself and what drives and what wills are within you that allow for anything external to exist. So that so and pretty much all, and because of those early thinkers who essentially formed the fields of sociology and psychology and all, and modern philosophy, had those assumptions. Everything that then emanated from them was not just merely secular. I think they're very anti-theistic thinkers, and that is expression and filters all the way down to our current field of study. So when a young Muslim goes, or anyone else might have faith, might go and study these fields, whether at GCSE or A level or onwards, they're essentially embodying unconsciously even the very epistemological and ontological assumptions of those early thinkers, unknowingly and unwittingly. So you're very correct, and because, as I said, in my opinion, and it would be hard to disagree, I think, for most people, that Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx are the founders of the modern world and their entire worldview. And Ramdi Saab interestingly said that all the other modern ideologies are like a cocktail between these thinkers. And if you actually really look into it, it is, for most part. So we are invariably being hugely influenced by that inversion of epistemology and ontology. And that was a major step, and that's why I think it's very important to study that and see what actually influenced that undertaking, so that we can at least de-psychologize ourselves, de-sociologize ourselves, and so forth from all the other sources. Like these young Muslims listen to Jordan Peterson talk about religion in a particular symbolic manner. They don't know about Freud and Jung and what drove him, and they don't know how shocking and subversive those ideas were in the first place. So, yeah, I completely agree with you there.
All right, yeah, thank you. I mean, I did feel that it's not just the simple sentence that's describing the situation. It's a massive philosophical change that has happened in the background. So
Yeah.
just moving on from this idea, you mentioned in one of the slides, you mentioned a definition of religion, because one of the things that I found confusing is that once you take this secular and humanistic point of view of the human expression of religion and religious ideas, it seems like it becomes very, very difficult to um, define religion, um, because how would you define religion now? Honestly, if I try and define religion as a religious person, I mean, I can simply say stuff like it has to do with certain beliefs about God, and based on those beliefs, how does those beliefs manifest in my life? I would, let's say, describe religion like that. But
Mm.
all these secular theorists, have they been really able to come to a single definition of what religion is?
Well, for the thinkers that I mentioned, they mean whatever religion they want it to mean. So again, Freud, for most, it'll be or for much of them, it's the Judeo-Christian tradition manifesting itself in the post-Protestant European framework. But yeah, I mean, it's very, as I said, I do agree with that writer I was talking about. That the concept of religion is just completely modern, and it's only for external people to box in a very specific people in a particular region doing something in a manner. And I kind of came to that realization like a few years ago when I used to work in schools a lot, and I was teaching there, and then it was lunchtime, and I was just sitting, and some students next to me were preparing for their religious studies exam, and they were the white students, and they were preparing for the exam on Islam, and the manner in which they were talking about Islam in preparing for the exam, oh, it's about rituals, and then fasting is this thing, and Hajj is this one thing. It seemed, yeah, they were right ostensibly about the categories of aspects of religion, but that cold and callous objectivity of defining those terms seemed completely alien to my or our experience of those things. So even defining or calling those terms certain things can just feel very alien to the people inside that group, as it might be. It totally ignores the strength and depth of personal piety and faith that you talked about, and then everything that emerges from that piety and faith. For some people, of course, religion can just be finding a manual and then getting a tick box of things that you have to do. But people who embody that piety, then will just look at that concept of religion and be like, this is that's not my religion. That's for a fact. Um, yeah, so I think it's just the it's what and again I'll call the reign of quantity, the need to define everything, the need to quantify everything in place within categories and numbers that has emerged in that, and then yeah, just this is the human impulse to categorize everything they see, but sometimes you have to give a tidy definition. If you've got a course on religious studies, you have to define something. So that's what I tried to do in the beginning. I tried to say, okay, we've got this term religion, what were the roots, and here's where the waters get a bit murkier. Know that before we go into this thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard something similar from kind of leftist Indian writers as well, that they say that before British colonialism, people did not used to look at Hinduism as a religion, some sort of a category like that. I mean, it was their civilization, and they were kind of living it, and they weren't like
Mm,
describing it
mm,
in such words. It's the
yeah.
British who came in, and they had to now look at all the different populations that were living in under their rule, and then they had to kind of label everyone with a particular label of a particular religion, right? So these are Hindus, and these are Christians, and these are
Yeah.
Muslims, and all sorts of others.
Yeah. It's like that cold
So
callous to just categorizing in order to pass an
yeah,
exam or to divide and
yeah.
conquer. So, no, not saying there aren't fundamental differences between uh, Muslims and Hindus, but
Hmm.
obviously it's that for me, at least in my definition, it will be piety and then everything else that emanates from that thing,
Hmm.
rather than again we see religion from that secular perspective. Again, that thing they do on Sunday, it's
Hmm.
like you know you can be a member of a golf club, have Nietzschean philosophy, and you can have this thing called a religion, which is again I think some people have tried to make that difference between deen and mazhab. which I think is very important in terms of separating out that aspect. I know Gandhi Sahib says the two same things, but I don't think so.
So just on that, I mean, if you are associating religion, the word religion with modernity, what is your understanding? What were people before this modern period doing? Well, how they were understanding religion before that?
It was what we would call worldview, Weltanschauung, according to the Germans. It's just, it was like, again, I give that example, how we understand gravity. Like, it's just the world that's around us. It's not like a philosophy that we aim to understand. Like,
Right.
like when we lived in Pakistan or around that time, people just, for them, God was reality. It wasn't this thing where they had to read through a book and then, of course, then theology, which
Yeah.
it builds on that thing to create this edifice called religion. Then, of course, there are sociological factors which make people in a certain place have a very particular concept about that thing. But the idea of deen, and then as I said, piety that emerges, it's not something a religion or a manual can teach you.
Yeah.
I think that's what they understand by religion.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's something that you mentioned earlier, and that kind of anticipated a question that I was going to ask is, you were talking about how these thinkers, they've kind of killed off religion, and they've substituted it with, yet another philosophy that serves as a religious philosophy. I was going to ask, what do you think is the God in this new philosophy? I think you already mentioned it, but I'm just going to, state my understanding of it. I feel that in this new religion that they've invented, now the God in this new religion is the self. They spend all the time talking about the self, the understanding of the self, the various parts of the self, and developing the self. And it seems like this is the be all and end all, and this has become their center of attention. And if you refer to the Quran, there's a verse which says that some people take their selves as gods, right? So I'm just drawing a parallel over there. So what is your understanding of what have they substituted God with in their new philosophy?
Well, I think that was that major shift that happened in the Enlightenment, right? The dictum was man is the measure of all things, and again, it was what you talked about, the inverted epistemology, with everything now emerges from the human. But I think with Freud and Jung was that they kind of Freud had this famous thing that Copernicus showed that that the world wasn't the center of the universe. Darwin showed that human beings weren't the center of creation, and then Freud then did that what he called the Copernican revolution, was that he showed that mankind is in control of his own life. And so he even deconstructed the self even further, saying that you think you're in conscious control of all your behavior and actions. No, actually there's this complete abstract thing called the unconscious, which is completely out of your control, which actually determines who you are. And one could argue that that's just an epiphenomenon of the self itself. But yeah, that is basically placing the self at where God is. And I think we are sort of drifting away from that. So G.K. Chesterton has a famous quote. So Karl Marx famously said that religion is the opiate of the masses, and Chesterton replied in text, in writing, saying that no, it's actually irreligion, that's the opiate of the masses. And then when you remove God, you actually worship the strongest thing in the world. And for the longest time, then that was the human will and the human desire. And then it's about that's why psychotherapy is about yourself. It's not about the greater sociological conditions or a religious understanding. It's about developing yourself. Right? Even I think now, because of the muddying of the water of what Freud did, and now postmodernism, where they've completely deconstructed the self, they're saying that they're essentially arguing that there's no coherent self that exists from point A to point B, from your beginning to death. It's just like chemicals at any given moment, and then your memory that might give you a coherent sense of idea of who you are, and then obviously all the sociological stuff that are appearing in, and now you understand language and so on and so forth. So even the self has been completely deconstructed and eliminated. So I think that the worship of the self was primarily an Enlightenment project, which has been sort of cut down by the postmodernists, and now it's who's the God now? I think mostly it's just technology and money now, which is the most powerful things in the world. So yeah, it's I think that's why I think postmodernism is fantastic, because it brought the logical conclusion of the Enlightenment to show that no, the self that you worship is actually, nothing really. So there's the Sufis and the Buddhists who are having a good laugh at this right now. So interesting, right?
Yeah, interesting indeed, interesting indeed. So, I mean, these were the few opening questions that I had. Now I'd like to kind of open it up to the other participants. If you've got any questions, who would like to go first? You can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Assalamualaikum, Luqmaan and Azabai, well done. Very, very, very good lecture. Lot of understanding, lot of details, and I'm sure a lot to come. Just one thing before I ask my questions is that can you share the list of books that you mentioned earlier, so that that remains on the reading list. The idea you mentioned earlier, and which was discussed briefly as well, is that man creates his own God. I mean, the thing is, I don't understand why there is anything wrong with this idea, to be honest, because we cannot know God like we can know anything. Like I can know, this is a car, or this is a color, or anything like that. So whatever we define God to be is just a reflection of the observer. So observed is already there, but the observer is just reflecting, or whatever it's defining is just based on itself. So really, the man create God. I don't think there is anything wrong with it. So anything to add to that?
No, absolutely. So I think the quote and statement there isn't man understands God or man interprets God. I mean, of course, Islam tells you that, but the implication still there is that there is an external reality called God, and God through his names and attributes is trying to give you a glimpse of what he is. So there is something out there that sent a revelation to all the prophets, Jesus and Muhammad and David before him and Moses. The implication of the statement that God doesn't create man, man creates God, is that there is no external reality. It's all a figment of man's imagination, and that is what they're trying to understand. They're not even they're not turning inwards to understand the limitations of human psychology, to understand how we can understand God. It's not a negative theology. It's purely to understand what conditions give rise to man feeling need for God and religion, and that's the end of the story. There is no external reality. So I think that's the primary difference of that meaning. Of course, the fact that human beings are just completely broken vessels that can't understand it. Even the book that lies on my table, I can't understand what it actually is ontologically. That's just a fact. I can't understand God, much less the book. So it's about that fact that I know that a book exists there. Now, if you tell me no, the book is the figment of my imagination, I'm completely living in a solipsistic world, then that's a very different thing.
Okay. I mean, if we look at it from very external point of view, right? The definition of God, the attributes which have been given, through Islam, that we know of. If you look at it, they are very, they are very much, cultural. Some of that is driven by the cultural understanding of God as well. Because if during that period, if you were to go to India or somewhere else where there were different religions, where the cultural understanding would be different, then the attributes that you would find there would be different as well. So yes, I mean, maybe I'm stepping into a bit of a territory, Mu'tazila territory here, but to put a definition based on attributes or anything like that, it is just that it's just regardless of which culture or where you come from, it is still a reflection. It is not. It is not the actual self, because that is unimaginable, undescribable, and that's why it remains where it is.
And that's why I think Islam forbids, and Old Testament Judaism as well, and possibly the New Testament as well, forbids anthropomorphization of God, whether through visuals or language or idols, because idols then become a repository of all that cultural influences of what we think God might be. So the Chinese Jesus looks very different from the African Jesus. It looks very different from the European Jesus. So, that's where that sense of self then comes in and then manifests itself. So again, even I think focusing too much perhaps on the attributes can itself become an idol, and then a misunderstanding of the essence of God in many ways, which one should retain as a mystery and understand their own limitations. So in this, in some ways, understanding what you just said is a way of approaching negative theology, knowing that we can't understand God, and through not knowing what we not know, we can get a better sense of what God is. Otherwise, we just end up making idols, both through words and pictures. So I don't know if that helps.
It's just that each time the expansion take place of the understanding. I mean, maybe hundreds of years ago, 1,000 years ago, people believed for example, the clouds and the rain. There was God there who was sending all the rain, and there was the angels, they're throwing what we call electricity and everything like that. But what we find is that through science we managed to sort of quantify that understanding of what the clouds are. So where 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, people believe, oh, it's God up there, who's pushing or who's doing all this, is now, because it's been quantified, it's just that the God has been pushed back, back in a way that now we have to go beyond the clouds and beyond the rain and beyond the sun in order to understand more. And as soon as you grow or get to that level of understanding, let's just say we go beyond the stars and before, then it's just that the God just keep pushing back and back and back.
I mean, I would respond saying that understanding the mechanisms tells you nothing about the teleology or the causes of the thing, right? And of course, other religions who didn't have revelation, I think I just saw a quick comment from Advan saying, that's why you've got revelation. There's other cultures, again, they don't have revelation from God in many ways. So they're just, again, relying on their pop psychology at the time, or pop philosophy, or pop religion to say that, or just give people some kind of explanatory causes, which is what science is and was and will continue to be until we get to a clearer understanding, which we can't, as you quite rightly pointed out, the limitations of human understanding. So we're just getting in many ways, that those aspects of religion and what we have now are just various differing metaphors of talking about the same thing. So for all intents, whoever was dragging the sun across the sky was a different theory for the orbit of, or the sun moving along a certain axis, or the Earth moving around the sun's orbit, or whatever. Again, even science now doesn't ever claim to tell you things as they are. That's metaphysics. Physics just purely tells you about the relations of things within very particular conditions. So we don't know what things are. We have various metaphors of talking about them. That's just my opinion, I guess, on the matter. So I wouldn't deride the older explanations, as people 1,000 years from now will be laughing at what we have to say.
Thank you.
Welcome.
All right, thank you very much. Irfan, do you want to kind of read out your question?
Sorry, is that me?
Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah,
Imran, not Irfan. I'm sorry about that. Go ahead.
That's okay. That's fine. Yeah. So obviously you've done a fair amount of research in preparation for this. So could you please sort of summarize what kind of changes happened, as in your sort of viewpoints and your outlook as a result of the research that you've undertaken and presented, and how do you hope to maintain those changes? Obviously, given the fact that it's very countercurrent and different compared to what most people think.
So with me, the fact is that I have been studying psychology in some form or another over the last 13 years. And the truth of the matter is that for the longest time, I was very uncritically engaging, not just with modern psychology, but psychoanalysis and all these ideas, without getting to the root of what assumptions they're making. And in some ways, my mind was like a complete mess in terms of like a double think or squaring circles, and then thinking, okay, we've got this idea, but I can somehow concurrently have this other conception of human nature as well, and I ended up doing a master's in psychoanalysis without questioning the entire damn thing in the whole year. So this research, and I think with my growing understanding of various other fields, such as sociology and politics and philosophy as well, it's helped to clarify in my mind, at least, the genealogy of the ideas and where they emerged from, what assumptions they made, and what influences it had on all the current ideas. And now I can place those ideas wherever they emerge and the influences that they had on current psychology, where they emanated from, and then critique those ideas. So, and this is very important in Gandhi Saab's approach as well. Like, you know, I remember that when we were in the session that we met in 2010, he was there at Heathrow, and he said, you know, if you want to refute an idea, never go in trying to refute the idea. Understand the whole thing in its own terms, without critiquing it, without questioning it. Understand it as they say it, and once you've understood it properly, after an iterative process, identify the principles and then respond to the principles. So what this endeavor, or at least this continuing endeavor has done for me, is the ability to identify what those emanating principles are and refute them at the core, or at least see what the challenge is in the beginning, rather than fighting off the offspring in all the other forms that have appeared. So I think that's what's been or is the continuing benefit of a venture like this, and why I even think about talking about this to other people. So this isn't a personal battle I have at like 4 a.m. in the morning. I think everyone who is engaged in the modern world has in some way or another imbibed the ideas of Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, and all the other pop psychology stuff. Like the very fact that we even talk about something called personality traits and all this stuff, that emerges from psychoanalytic research. So Jung was the first person to even talk about a thing called personality, and all of this stuff, when we talk about projection or defense mechanisms and all this stuff, it's in common parlance, and we talk about it as if it's fact. And I imagine how much of that is exaggerated for someone who's systematically studied psychology or any of the social sciences that are affected by any of these. So again, I think for myself and for everyone else, go back to the roots, lose some sleep over this stuff. As Gandhi Saab said, do not critique it at first, understand it on its own terms, identify the foundations, and then respond to that. Then you will not have to fight the individual demons that came after them, who were influenced by their ideas. So I don't have to refute Jordan Peterson anymore. I can go to the core, see where those ideas came from, and respond to those ideas as they appear. So that's the benefit of that for me, and for I think anyone else who wants to be part of this battle, venture, discovery. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that was good. Thank you so much. I've got another question if it's not too much to ask.
No, we've got 2 hours.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you. Okay, so how did you plan and test out the changes that you sort of discovered as a result of the research? And what did you learn from your initial sort of, after you've made those changes in your outlook, in your philosophy, in your thinking? How did you measure and reflect on those?
I think it just allows for a greater sense of clarity in terms of, and this is very, very, I think, exactly what Reza was saying earlier about that epistemological inversion, where there was a certain change that happened in a very particular religious, Western, intellectual, post-Reformation context that determined all the knowledge that we get from school onwards. And knowing that there was a conscious move that arose out of certain conditions, for me at least, proves that it didn't have to be this way if other currents were followed, and possibly that same inversion can happen within Muslims if we unconsciously just adopt everything that modernism has given without actually going through the post-Reformation, all that stuff that allowed for modernism to take place. We just, unconsciously adopt all the stuff, and then that's what happens now when you see among Muslims, who call themselves Muslim feminists or Muslim socialists and all this other stuff, which they kind of like embodying 2 very, very different set of assumptions, 2 very, very different sets of constellations. So I think the process has, in a sense, allowed me to know that this is this and that is that, and there really aren't any overlaps, and then you have to pick a side to reconcile any kind of cognitive dissonance that might arise between having a doublethink position. And I think that is a challenge for every Muslim nowadays. Like, if one claims to have a certain set of Islamic principles, and they're working from a completely materialistic field where the utterances betray certain assumptions which are not only antithetical but just so far removed from Islam, then they've got to deal with that thing. And I think that's what the benefit of this process has been over the past few years, at least, in placing things where they are, and then picking a side one way or another, rather than holding 2 countercurrent positions.
Yeah, no, honestly, I agree. I think that's such a good reflection point. I think my own personal experience and reflection, I thought to myself how with different times and how different societies change, you know, the different sources of epistemology that they use or reasons to justify the arguments or worldviews, it can just flip all of a sudden. So you got someone like, you know, Jeremy Bentham, you know, who argued regarding the tyranny of the majority and how he used that in order to establish that just because you have majority people on one thing doesn't necessarily mean, you know, that it's the right thing. But, you know, when you have a modern outlook like change of circumstance, for example, in the future, if you have like the normalization of, you know, things antithetical to Islam, such that it becomes, you know, to a critical mass and like, you know, many people, and it just becomes a default in our society. It's just so interesting how in the beginning, they did not take that assumption, but later on, when the time suits them and the societal conditions suit them, then the sort of justifications for the worldviews will just flip and change. So it's just interesting, like, to see how you're taking a principled approach and applying it to everything. You know, you're not being a favoritist or anything, like you're actually going to deep into the core of the issues and determining what the true reality of it is.
And not even determining true. Again, it's like that negative psychology coming from negative theology, at least knowing what it wasn't. And the funny thing is that because of history, what Bentham said or what Mill said now has just become axiomatic. The idea of liberalism, right? Which is now it's like you have to actually then go to the person and run them through the ideas, be like, you know, this dude had this idea from a very particular perspective, and now it just filtered through, and now people are talking about liberalism as if it's the only mode of social being, and that anything not liberal is basically you're a fascist now. It's like, no, hold on. These ideas emerge from somewhere, and if you can deal with them and then respond to them, those fundamental assumptions, I think you won't have to, you know, fight with the feminists or the LGBTQ crowd or all that. So because the liberals made a very specific assumption about what it means to be a human being, right? Do what thou wilt, essentially. And then I've heard Muslims call themselves liberal Muslims. And the irony of that, where liberal means one thing and Muslim to submit to Allah means one thing, how do they circle that square is unknowable to me. So again, go to the roots of these ideologies and ideas, and then it becomes easier, I suppose. But every Muslim will have to do that if they're involved in this any kind of endeavor. So as Hamza Yusuf says, you know, if you don't philosophize for yourself, somebody else will philosophize for you, and people think these ideas are theirs. No, they're not. So another quote from Jung is like, you know, people don't have ideas have people, and people don't realize that. So just exercise yourself from these ideas by killing those demons one demon at a time. So I'm not saying I'm doing it well, but I'm saying this might be, I guess, this is my psychological exorcism to unpsychologize myself. So we'll see the process. This is the exorcism part 4. Do you have any questions in the comments? Was that all?
Perhaps if no one else is going to ask, I can ask another. But
go ahead.
I'm a bit conscious of others. Yeah, I think maybe.
Yeah, let's make this a concluding question. Yeah, go ahead, and we'll wrap up the session.
Sure. Okay, so I assume this is like independent research that you're conducting at the moment. I'm not sure whether you had like other people helping or sort of helping you to prepare this, but if you did have other people, how did you engage them? And, you know, any other sort of stakeholders, for example, in preparation for your research?
So I think in the beginning of the outline, I told how this course kind of emerged from speaking to Rosa. But I think in looking outwards towards, say, like an Islamic response to the psychology of religion, something which happened, you know, 130 years ago now, there's no literature on it. There's nothing on it. There's no Islamic response or Muslim psychologists who have thought deeply about it. Muslim psychologists have unconsciously incorporated the assumptions of Freud into a thing called Islamic psychology, Islamic counseling, right? So it's like Muslims are working with the emanations of certain assumptions, which, again, as I said, they're trying to circle squares. So I think to answer your question, going back, is that I was kind of like disappointed that I didn't find any other resources or people who were talking about these things in very concrete terms. So I feel like very much that this endeavor, in some ways, is laying the tracks as we go along, and through discussions with yourselves and putting on your own experiences and understanding of the ideas, I think we can answer, or at least aim to answer some of those questions as they go along. And then you are the ones that are helping this discussion go along. So I haven't planned too far ahead, so I have an overall plan of what we want to do. I've studied those thinkers and those works prior, so it's not like I'm going in completely cold through my education as well. So yeah, this is a very active endeavor. This isn't me lecturing or preaching or anything or telling you this is that. So I wholly appreciate countercurrent thoughts, even like what Qasim said earlier, and inquisitive questions like itself. So let's see where it goes.
All right. Thank you very much. Those were excellent questions. And let's wrap up the session over here. And first of all, I'd like to thank Luqmaan for an excellent session.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm already looking forward to what goodness you're going to bring in the later session. This was just the introduction. And I hope your 13 years of investigation into psychology and your realizations in your kind of later years has given you, I suppose, some sort of a mission to, bring better understanding to Muslims of what kind of a reality they are living in terms of the ideas that are prevalent, and to better understand them, if nothing else.
100%. Like I look at my students, and most of them are young Muslim women, and they all want to go into become psychotherapists and clinical psychologists. And I'm thinking, I really thought this thing through, and I don't blame them because I had all those misgivings myself. So, inshallah, make dua that can come to fruition. So this is a good step towards that. So.
And with that, I'll also like to thank my co-participants in this session, and thank you very much. And
thank you, Rosa, and Qasim and Imran for joining. See you next week, 2 weeks, inshallah.